So Rob Houle is a community member here at Edmonton who's been part of the policing conversation for a long time. As someone who served on various Indigenous advisory councils and committees with the Edmonton Police, as well as the Community Safety and Wellbeing Task Force this past couple of years here. So I really enjoyed this interview with Rob. I think that Rob is someone who's really well informed about various perspectives when it comes to policing, and also has lived experience as someone who went through an incident of police brutality in 2005 that influenced a lot of his perspective on policing. And in our conversation, me and Rob kind of go into a little bit of the cycle of police asking for additional money from politicians, and how there are a lot of, contradictions and a lot of missteps when it comes to the past that we kind of give police, in this idea of whether or not things are going well or badly, whether or not we actually have metrics to actually track performance. Funding keeps going up. And this is not necessarily a rule that's applied to almost any other organization or institution. So another thing that Rob, I think, does a really good job of doing in this interview is kind of tracing the roots of policing as a colonial practice against Indigenous people, and as something that's always been inherently violent and inherently built to displace people and protect property, and acquire property for the ruling class, which in Canada historically has been, white settlers, and especially in Edmonton too. So Rob also points to the fact that we essentially have services right now, such as the Bent Arrow Society, such as the Bear Clan Patrol, Reach Edmonton, services that are operating, that need funding, that need support, and that play a crucial part in community safety, but aren't necessarily put on the same level, or at least given the same respect, as the Edmonton Police for the serious work that they do in the community. So I want to give you a heads up before you listen to this interview that it was conducted over the phone, because that's what Rob was most comfortable with. And the audio quality might not be the best or what you maybe expect it to be, but I can assure you that all of Rob's answers to my questions are fantastic. Very, very good, very insightful. So yeah, I hope you enjoy the interview and everything Rob has to say. Do you want to maybe tell listeners a bit about your origins in the conversations around policing, around justice, and this new kind of umbrella term of community safety?
Yeah, for sure. So I am originally from northern Alberta. I grew up in the kind of the Slave Lake area, and I am from Swan River First Nation, which is a community just north of Slave Lake, on the shores of Lesser Slave Lake. Grew up there on and off reserve. Grew up in the town. Came to the city after kind of graduating high school, and then after high school went into post-secondary. And the reason that I became involved in kind of social justice and policing is because in 2005, myself and my brother were the victims of a Starlight tour at the hands of the Edmonton Police Service. I guess these were prominent and commonplace activities at that time that I didn't learn about until much, much later in life. And then I've also been involved in Indigenous relations and working with the Indigenous community, increasing their advocacy and voice. And that naturally led me into looking at justice and policing, because Indigenous people are overrepresented in all of those systems. And then I was happy to be part of the Community Safety Wellbeing Task Force that was created by the city in 2020. And from there, I just continue to be an advocate and continue to challenge these kind of systems that are abusing BIPOC individuals and Indigenous people, and still seeking justice for my complaint against the Edmonton Police Service for my treatment in 2005.
So when it comes to your own personal case, stemming all the way back to 2005, do you feel like justice has been delivered for your case? You mentioned that you're still seeking it. So what is the situation with that?
Well, the whole process has been a long-standing, ongoing process, and it helped to highlight the flaws in the system and the problems with police investigating police and not taking claims very seriously and whatever else. So my understanding, my latest update is that it's sitting. It might be on the police chief's desk. It might be on Dale McPhee's desk right now. He may have to review it, but I provided all the information that I can provide. We have witnesses, we have corroborating statements, we have all the information that we could provide to the best of our ability. So it's all sitting with the EPS. Again, the problem with police investigating police is that my complaint originally fell off the table a number of years ago. I had to hire a lawyer to get it revitalized and get it taken more seriously. And then we've been through that process ever since. But through the work of the task force, it helped me to better understand how flawed the system is and how lacking in accountability the Edmonton Police Service and other institutions are in regards to their conduct with people.
And so, yeah, you mentioned when you answered my first question that you grew into challenging the flaws that we see in the system. Do you maybe want to share with listeners a few of the challenges that you think are pretty obvious when it comes to policing, and then the larger justice system? I think that legislates and I guess authorizes these kind of actions by armed officers, and I guess especially against Indigenous people who in this country I think have faced unique challenges when it comes to police brutality and oppression against police.
Yeah, I think it starts. It starts at the very beginning of Canada, of Canadian history, of the march westward of the RCMP, or the Northwest Mounted Police, and the establishment that created them to not protect the West, but to kind of corral and contain Indigenous people in the West. That's what the Northwest Mounted Police were created for. Sand, steel, all that mythos, all that nonsense. It wasn't to free anybody. It was actually to restrict and contain the flourishing Indigenous people that were in the West. And then from there, that model of policing became kind of the model that all of these other institutions now follow. So again, if the root of policing in Canada was to suppress Indigenous people, then it would make sense that the ongoing creation of these other institutions and organizations would continue that suppression, because that's what they were designed to do. And the evidence is in the courts, it's in the justice system, it's in the staggering statistics that continue to come out on how 50% of women in the justice system are Indigenous in the jails, and we only represent a small margin of the overall population in the country. So that tells you that there's serious flaws leading to incarceration rates and over criminalization of Indigenous people, and that the systems don't progress, they don't change, they don't shift, they just continue doing the same kind of practice that's been in place since 1885, 1884, around the early days of this country. And again, it goes back to the root of the issue, and then it just continues to extrapolate from there. And then you see it in kind of the way that these institutions and these organizations deal with Indigenous people on the daily, and then how people that are intending to go into those systems treat people on the daily. And you see story after story of Indigenous people being brutalized, being victimized, being kicked out of a city center mall by people who are given even an inch and an ounce of authority, then abusing that authority to chastise Indigenous people on our own territories. I think that is what the overarching system was designed to do, and continues to do, and continues to perpetuate. And you don't have to look any further than news headlines of the day to see another body, another policing force doing something to BIPOC and Indigenous people in a vile, volatile and violation kind of process that this country in Canada is kind of founded upon. So bringing that into perspective with dealing with and criticizing the Edmonton Police Service and other institutions, trying to hold them to a higher level of standard, a higher level of accountability, has kind of driven this advocacy and this search for justice overall for everyone that's been involved with even minor interactions with police services.
And so you've been involved in the public conversation around justice and policing for quite some time now. And I would say that it's pretty widely known that there's been a conversation shift since summer 2020. But from your perspective, from 2010 to 2020, how would you say that decade was characterized when it came to conversations around reform and policing and community relationships between groups like Indigenous people, Black people, and police departments and the justice system largely?
Well, it's definitely been a period of fluctuation. There's been some positive actions, but again, when new leadership come into place, when new governments take power, we always see this same cyclical action of policing where there's a call for increased accountability. The people that were calling for it then fall to the wayside, and then it goes back into the same old course of business that policing has always done. And in the case of the Edmonton Police Service, we see that with the racism kind of initiatives in the early 2010s or even before that, where there was a push for community safety. There was a lot of focus on marginalized communities. I remember in the early days, there was this emphasis and focus on the Somali community, and there were all these task force created, and there was organizations like Reach Edmonton that were established that had kind of community-based initiatives and youth-based initiatives to get people to challenge this image of violence that was being perpetuated in the media and by the police service, which again, by focus and targeting those services on that one group of people, then alienated them even further and continued to perpetuate this story and this misnomer of Somali violence, when marginalized communities are no more violent than any other kind of organization and are much less involved in crime and blue-collar crime and things like that. But again, we see this cycle of re-victimization, re-emphasis, and access to more resources. So you see a huge influx of funding following those kind of movements, where there's very little checks and balances. You see more authority given to the Edmonton Police Commission, which again, and it came up through the kind of conversations at City Council, how there's a lack of accountability and real community representation there. So people have zero information on what is actually happening. And we saw the high profile things with Scott McKean and others complaining about the new tank that the Edmonton Police Service bought that was kind of slipped under the rug. So you see this in these cycles of community emphasis, targeting specific communities, massive funding influxes. You have them freezing the funding formula, and then you have new leadership come in with fresh ideas that want to put things into check. They start to push the initiative, and then you just see, again, even today with the response from the Edmonton Police Service, you see them fall into the same cycle of, well, these bad guys downtown, these troublemakers, we don't have enough resources, we don't have enough accountability, we need more people on the ground, and then it leads to more funding kind of injections or arguments. And I think over the last 10 years, you've seen this unbridled support for policing, which I think is kind of interesting because when you look at the data, when you look at the statistics, policing and law enforcement is the only industry, the only service where your performance doesn't have any merit on whether or not you get funding. You can do poorly, you can have crime rates skyrocket through the roof, and then you use that as a justification to get more funding because you don't have enough to stop crime. If things are going well, crime rates are down, you see the same messaging from the police where we're doing such a great job, we need more money to keep doing such a great job. And I think that's something that is being lost on the general public, but I hope is coming to the forefront with some of these budget conversations we're having.
Yeah, so I guess segueing off that end of your point there, so budget conversations are changing now at City Council, and I would say that there are a few. There is at least one, like Michael Jans is pretty outspoken when it comes to his intention to give the police less money. There are counselors who are seriously open about questioning the fact that we continually fund and increasingly fund our police department. And then you obviously have detractors, but even in the detractors, I guess now we also see an acknowledgement that it is incredibly unsustainable, and there are a lot of questions around, like you said, metrics, performance, the fact that it's a pretty fractured system when it comes to community safety. Yeah, from what you saw in the last budget cycle, what gives you optimism, and do you envision or do you see anything substantially changing? And talks around a potential forensic audit that Aaron Paquette brought up, and also talks of opening up the funding formula for Edmonton Police.
Yeah, I think the fact that the funding formula was frozen, first of all, and kind of put aside, I think was the first kind of real victory, because for me that was one of the greatest grifts that ever took place with the previous city council, was the sell job they did on that funding formula, that police, like any other kind of essential service, should have their funding escalated yearly and to a greater rate than what even the city of Edmonton base funding was receiving. Was I think just a fantastic kind of sell job on what policing doesn't really need to have in place. And so the fact that funding formula was put aside was the first kind of real push forward for change. And I think now, with conversations happening around a new funding formula, establishing some new metrics, which show council and the community at large kind of questioning the metrics that are being followed. Because you look at the annual reporting of the Edmonton Police Service, they're allowed to follow and measure their own metrics, whatever they desire. So they have response times, they have recruitment, they have BIPOC officers, they have LGBTQ2S plus officers in their force, they have complaints against officers. These are the things that they themselves have elected to track. And when you even examine their data on those metrics, they're missing a lot of them to a large degree, and they're missing their targeted response times. They're missing their recruitment stats have been stagnant. They are recruiting as many BIPOC individuals that are into the force that are leaving the force, and that tells me that there's a real issue with the system as a whole. If you can't retain officers longer than you should, in a system that has unlimited funding and then limited accountability, it should be easier to keep people on board. And so as long as we're shifting the conversation and holding them to different accountability, I think we're making good headway. The fact that they still managed to get an increase based upon Truth and Reconciliation Day still leaves a bad taste in my mouth with this council. I think, again, we were very close to having a conversation around just phrasing it outright. But the fact that they were able to use the holiday Dale, Chief McPhee, was able to use the holiday as a Métis person to justify funding increase should hold a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, because a lot of other organizations, a lot of governments had to absorb those costs, shift things accordingly, and then to saddle council with having to increase the funding. And even though it was only $1 million, it's still an ongoing increase, which again, when the community was up in arms, we pushed for a wholesale funding freeze, and really a chance to do better things with the money that is frozen. And the Safer for All report outlines how much money could be saved, how much money could be redistributed to the community. And then the problem is that, of course, with COVID and everything else, the previous council wasn't able to unleash a lot of that funding that was frozen, or they did for other kind of community initiatives and organizations and grant programs, I think is what happened to it. But now with this other freeze ongoing, it gives us a better opportunity to redistribute the funds to the community, to give people and organizations the funding that they need, so that the police can do less. And I think that's something that's also come out over this whole course of funding and conversations, is that the police are doing a lot. They're being asked to do a lot, and that is because the community as a whole has offloaded a lot of responsibility to them, because they are a law enforcement agency. So once we start to take back some of that community ownership, maybe we can better align our priorities, and maybe the Edmonton Police Service can do what they're intended to do, which is to keep people safe. And it's hard to keep people safe when you're dealing with all of these other things that police deal with. So with that comes a funding conversation, and hopefully a flowing of more equitable funding to other organizations that are really needed to do the good work that they're doing.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some of those other organizations, and I guess maybe the conversation around authority. So that was something that Chief McPhee brought up to City Council in his argument for sustained funding, was that police still have the authority because they receive a lot of the calls. When I say calls, I mean, calls, emergency calls, whether they be, medical or safety or whatever number of things they could be. Police receive those calls, and they also have the legislative authority to, I guess, act on those problems and, be a part of the solution. But we also have groups in Edmonton like Bear Clan Patrol, who you mentioned before, who are actively in the streets every single day, helping the community when it comes to helping provide resources, providing food, guiding people towards shelters, doing things like that. So when it comes to the conversation around authority and alternatives, do you maybe want to speak to the kind of future that you want to see, and where funding and authority should be directed to help people in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I think it's a very similar conversation to the metrics and the measurements kind of conversation, where the Edmonton Police Service and the Edmonton Call Center are under their kind of authority and their control. So essentially, the Edmonton Police Service and their officers and the call center employees, who to a large degree we heard through the task force work were former Edmonton Police Service officers, determine which call goes where and how people respond. And through their own admissions to City Council and the community, 30% of the calls that come in aren't even police work. They're social agency work, they're social services work. So again, when you have that much kind of work those many calls taking place that police shouldn't be involved in at all, and it isn't within their authority, then maybe we can look to other organizations to do a lot of that work. And it's not to say, and you always get caught into this, oh, well, what about the high risk, high volatile situations where there's domestic violence and all these other things? Yeah, well, no, that is what the police should be doing. No one's saying that the police shouldn't be doing what the police should be doing. They have guns and things for a reason, and that's to keep people safe in these highly volatile situations. But it's the other things that they don't require a gun to do, that are taking up a lot of their time. So again, it's a lot of the same conversation. So when you have a call come in, and an ex-police officer can determine whether or not who attends the call. That's also akin to kind of people choosing what kind of work they want to do for the day, and again, that's why we called for, as a task force, more transparency, independence from the police force, a better coordinated system where people, once you call 911, instead of fire, police, ambulance, maybe there's a mental health kind of option as well. If people are having a mental health crisis, and rather than sending the cops, maybe you send a mental health worker and another organization like crisis diversion or something like that. The problem is that we're not seeing those conversations happen at council. We're still seeing kind of Chief McPhee and the Edmonton Police Service manage what calls come in, and trying to determine how the call center is run, and trying to determine who answers what call, rather than the real transparent and accountable mechanisms that we need to see to have better organizations respond to some of these calls. And also, the resources need to flow to these organizations so they can do their work appropriately. We're seeing, I read in the news the other day, last week, that there was a murder in one of the shelters downtown. That tells me that that particular shelter doesn't have the resources required to properly search individuals for weapons, to properly do proper intake, to ensure people are safe when they're coming in there. And that's a failing in funding, that's a failing in resourcing, and it's a failure in the systems overall, that we're giving this organization that does all these other things that they're not supposed to be doing a boatload of money, and then these other kind of direct service providers are left fighting over the scraps that government throws out for prevention and other things. So I hope that the conversation continues to progress a little bit more, and that we start sending the right responders to the right calls, and we don't get caught in the whole misnomer of, well, the police need to go to everything because you never know what's going to happen. I agree, every situation is different, but there are for sure situations and calls that police have no business whatsoever walking into, and many of those are mental health calls and other things like that.
So that's it for my questions, Rob. Is there anything else that you want to add, or anything else that you think listeners should know relating to our conversation?
I think I just want to emphasize that, again, policing is one of the few institutions where, regardless of how well or poorly you're performing, there's always money provided to you. And in Edmonton in particular, that's come up directly through the budgeting process. That's come up directly through the last decade of advocacy and desire to shift things. And that I think the community should continue to hold people to account, and really don't, and pay less attention to these negative stories that are coming out. Because again, if police are there to prevent crime, then a lot of these situations should be preventable with the amount of funding that they receive. Yet they come back with stories and media stories about all of this violence taking place. Well, I thought the police were supposed to be there mitigating that violence, or security officers are supposed to be there. And if they're not, then maybe we should be doing something differently so that a lot of these occurrences can be avoided properly. And I think we're heading in the right direction, and that we just need to keep up the momentum, and things will change for the better. And that's my hope.